You know, it seemed like you guys really liked it the last time I did one of these videos. So after a little hiatus, you're finally getting a sequel. Here's 10 more facts about the development of Grand Theft Auto 4. Let's jump right into it with fact number 1. Why is the game suddenly the fourth one even though like 5 games came between that and the third one? Might seem weird at first. I mean, they did GTA 1, 2, and 3. Then the next one after 3 was Vice City, then San Andreas, then 2 PSP games. And only after all of that did we get 4, when technically it's like the 8th game. So what gives? Well, while they got into the habit of assigning the game a subtitle based on the setting, they decided to assign this one with the Roman numeral 4 to represent the leap in technology that they were making within production. The new technology behind it was a huge deal. When it was revealed and when it came out, it looked and felt so much different than anything that Rockstar had done prior to it. And seeing as how the people making the game were obviously aware of this from the get-go, they decided that giving it a brand new number for a title was the best way to represent the fact that this was going to be a step in a new and modern direction for the franchise. But developing games is no small task, and I bet you didn't know our second fact. About 1,000 people were responsible for getting this game finished and in a playable state, and that in itself was not easy. They were working with a brand new engine, and the only other game that was made in that engine was basically a remake of Pong, so they really had their work cut out for them with having to build a huge and detailed open-world game out of it. Oftentimes, the developers were pulling 12-hour shifts, and while none of the articles I read mentioned this, because it was the 2000s, it wouldn't surprise me at all if more than a few people were working 7 days a week on this game. So if you enjoyed playing it, just remember the amount of hard work that was put into it for the sake of your enjoyment. Remember, game development is not easy. You have to think about the amount of work that was put into the game's playable world itself, which leads us to the third fact, which is about the order that they designed the map and the story in. When they're making an open-world game that has a story mode to it, they need to make sure that the story that they come up with is going to properly utilize the playable area. To do this, Rockstar first designed the map, and then they came up with the story missions after. Now, I'm sure that a few in-game locations were changed later on in development to work around what might be required to be there for the story, say a certain building or an interior of some kind that they have to feature. But overall, the map was worked on first and foremost. Which makes sense. They wanted to have a solid location down first as a foundation for them to work with afterwards. And it would seem as though no story work was done until they had the map down. Kinda makes me wonder, how would the story have turned out if they had stuck with the original idea of setting the game across 3 states? What reason would Niko have to go to Connecticut, or Niagara Falls for that matter, other than to ride a speedboat off of it for fun? Fact number 4. How did they decide on what places in the New York area to include in the game? The staff at Rockstar all got to participate in figuring out what areas from real life were going to be recreated. They would regularly hold votes on what to include and what to ditch. So if you live in New York City or northern New Jersey and you're wondering why your neighborhood or town isn't in the game, it's probably because it got voted out because somebody decided that Bay Ridge or Rego Park or East Orange just didn't need to be in the game. Staten Island was a no-go from the start, too. Apologies to any Staten Islanders out there. Evidently, they thought that everything Staten Island has is already in New Jersey, and they decided it was worth featuring Jersey more. Fact number 5. Now, even though a lot of Rockstar staff worked in New York, not everybody who worked on the game lived there. A good majority of the 1,000 or so developers were in Scotland. I mentioned in the last video how they had TVs in their Edinburgh studio with footage of New York playing on a loop so that the developers could more accurately get a sense of how things should look and feel in the game. But many still got a more up-close view. 2 research trips were made to New York in order to gain more insight on the location while making the game. Some of the developers even got to ride along with New York City police officers. The first trip was made in March of 2005, still quite early in the game's development. The second trip would have been made around 2007, likely in the earlier part of the year, but still more than halfway through development. At that time, they probably thought the game was still going to be out later that same year. By the way, I think some of the reference photos that they took ended up in the files of the game. Some look like they were used as textures outside of buildings. Others I'm not so sure about. Maybe they were part of the reflections on certain buildings. But even going to New York and having cops take them on a tour wasn't the only way that they educated themselves on how to design Liberty City. For fact number 6, it turns out that a lot of staff at Rockstar hit the books to do even more research on the inner workings of the city. They read books on urban infrastructure, including the subways, sewers, and garbage collection, just to get an idea of how a city works and what critical infrastructure is needed and how that critical infrastructure is designed. They also studied city block layouts and architectural plans for apartments. It's actually really impressive how much effort went into designing Liberty City. They wanted things to look and feel as realistic as it could for the game world. When it comes from how the subway tunnels look, to how apartments are laid out, to how the entire city itself is laid out. It's kind of funny when you realize that this is the same studio that made the second island in Vice City, where there's a runway bent at an angle, and a ton of buildings are just plonked down everywhere with no rhyme or reason. I mean, look at this. You got apartments in the middle of a back alley, a building that has no door, and a high-rise downtown that doesn't even have street access. But I guess that's what happens when you make an open-world game in record time. They're not going to nail everything, as awesome as Vice City was. I'm not knocking the game, but the map design was a little funky in hindsight. But it just goes to show how far they advanced in just a few years. And I think they knew after that not to rush map design. Let's talk about something else now with fact number 7. This has more to do with the story and the main character. Evidently, the reason that they did a story based around an immigrant from Eastern Europe is because they wanted to tell a different kind of tale than what you would typically see in crime fiction that's set in New York. Most of the time back then, when people would think of New York criminals, they'd either think of the Italian mafia or street gangs. Rockstar even said themselves that with the amount of movies and TV shows set in New York that were about the mafia, they felt that the entire thing had become played out by the time they were writing this game. And they wanted to do something entirely different than what people would have expected. They didn't just want to make a game adaptation of The Sopranos, as awesome as that would have been, and I'm sure they would have done a fantastic job compared to what we got with the actual Sopranos game, whatever happened there. So they came up with Niko Bellic, a former soldier from Serbia that inadvertently falls into a life of crime. He still interacts with the mafia and street gangs in Liberty City, but he's more of a contract worker instead of actually belonging to any organization as a full member. The writers also reached out to criminal experts in order to help them out with coming up with these characters, most likely to flesh out their backgrounds and make their motivations a little bit more realistic, maybe. Fact number 8. If you ever failed a mission in GTA 4, you might have noticed a couple of things. For one, there's no such thing as checkpoints because this is a game from 2008, so you better get used to driving back and forth a lot if you screw up. But during these drives, we often get to hear dialogue between the characters if someone is riding along with you. Most of these drives have at least 2 sets of dialogue, but you'll only hear the second set of dialogue if you fail the mission the first time and have to repeat it.
A mafia-controlled waste management plan?
You fucking guessed it. It's an Ancelotti operation.
Exactly. You hang out in some strange places. First you take me to a fish market and now a waste plant?
They did this because they knew that if people failed a mission, they didn't want to have the entire thing to feel like Groundhog Day, where the same script is repeating over and over again with just slight variations with the main character's actions. So rather than doing that, they decided to treat you to a brand new conversation between the characters. It's kind of cool, even though it almost incentivizes you to fail, but you don't have to do that. If you want to hear all the possible dialogue that's in the game, I'd highly recommend checking out the All Possibilities series by whatever 57010. It's actually really interesting to watch. And if you're a fan of this game's story and you like these characters, you're going to get to hear a lot of dialogue that you may not have even heard before. Let's go into fact number 9 and talk about the radio now. It turns out it was really hard to license a lot of the songs that we hear in the game. Soundtrack supervisor Ivan Pavlovich talked about this in an interview with MTV from May of 2008. Rockstar had to reach out to over 2,000 people to obtain the publishing rights for all of the songs featured on the soundtrack. Up to $10,000 was spent per song, and there's 214 songs total in the game, so yeah, a good chunk of change was spent on licensing. And getting some of these songs turned out to be nothing short of a real pain in the rear end. Especially Walk the Night by the Scat Brothers, which can be heard on K109. Evidently, they had to hire a private investigator to find the surviving relatives of the members of this band just to be able to get their permission to feature that song. And I don't even know what they did to license the music on Vladivostok FM. But whatever they did, it obviously did not turn out so well by the time the 10th anniversary of the game rolled out, because they had to remove every single song except for the one that was made for the game. I guess you can consider that a bonus fact. If you play the game today and you listen to Vladivostok FM, it is not going to be the same playlist that we had in 2008. At the risk of sounding like one of those guys that says everything in the past was better, honestly, I do think that the original soundtrack was better. I've never even listened to Russian music before or after, but they managed to pick really catchy songs back then, I gotta say. And finally, let's go on to our last fact for the video. The game was originally meant to be a PlayStation 3 exclusive. Industry insider Michael Pachter had an interview with Eurogamer back in 2010. According to him, originally there were plans for GTA 4 to be exclusive on the PS3, or at the very least it would have been a timed exclusive, kind of like how the original trilogy was. They all came out first on the PS2, and then it took about a year or two after for them to come out on Xbox and PC. But according to Pachter, Microsoft apparently paid Rockstar and Take-Two $75 million in order to make it non-exclusive, and a big part of this deal included the 2 DLC packs being exclusive to Xbox for a period of time. It's kind of crazy to think about the fact that if this dude was for real, GTA 4 could have been a PS3 game only, or at the very least it would have been known for being a PS3 game more than anything. It obviously would have been built for that system in mind first and foremost, but if it remained an exclusive, I have a feeling that it would end up like Metal Gear Solid 4 where it's just stuck on that platform completely. So in a way, I guess I'm really glad that that didn't happen. I never had a PS3 anyway, so yeah. If you want to know more, I actually did a whole video about this a few years ago, so be sure to check that out. And that concludes this video on 10 more facts about GTA 4. Hope you found them all interesting. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.